You're listening to the Contextually Speaking podcast. I am your host, Art of the Rhyme. Today's episode is To Vax or Not to Vax, Part 2. Let's get to it. As humans, we were created with and for purpose and meaning. Our lives are designed to have meaning. And when meaning is absent, we will go in search of meaning, even if we have to manufacture it. Now, bear in mind that we are relational beings and that the two greatest gifts that the Most High gives us are time and relationships. And because of that, the true meaning of our lives is best seen and felt through the imprint that we have in and on the lives of others. Now, I'm not suggesting that our identity or our dignity or our worth is solely derived from what others think and say about us. What I am saying is that the impact that we have on the lives of others will resonate and it will outlive us. Case in point, if you've ever lost a loved one or a mentor or a great friend, then you can attest to what I'm saying. Basically, what I'm saying is this: none of us get to preach our own eulogy. So again, we are created, our lives are designed to have meaning. And when it is absent, we will go in search of it, even if we have to manufacture it. Also, as humans, we are wired to learn through narrative. We learn best through story. It is through story that we have established families and legacies. It is through story that we have built and maintained cultures and civilizations. It is through story that humanity has survived. Story is a part of our survival package. For example, we had to pass down traditionally through story what animals to avoid, what plants and foods to avoid, what plants and food were good for us. We had to learn how to do things and how to build things, how to avoid certain situations. And all of that is best passed down and learned through story. Now, with every experience that we have, we create a story in our head about that experience so that that experience will now have meaning. I remember years ago, I had a boss who I thought was unkind and unfair to me. And he happened to be Caucasian. So I told myself that he's treating me like this, my experience, that he's racist. That's the story I told myself. Now, I come to find out that he wasn't racist. He just didn't like me. He didn't like how I did things as an employee. But the story that I comforted myself with, the story that I told myself, was that the man was racist. And that just simply wasn't the case. So, here's what I want you to see about the stories that we create around our experiences. First of all, the stories that we create in our head, the stories we tell ourselves, we create them both consciously and subconsciously. Now, here's the problem with that: the subconscious cannot differentiate between fact and fiction, reality and fantasy. Also, the stories that we create within ourselves around our experiences, they will always be in alignment with our prejudices, our biases, and our presuppositions. There is something called the halo effect. And the halo effect will more likely than not be driving and shaping the narrative that we create. For example, tell you about my boss. I didn't want to believe that I was the bad guy. I created a story in which someone was the protagonist and someone was the antagonist. I made myself the protagonist. I made him the antagonist. Now, I totally ignored the fact that the department was full of blacks and Hispanics. So how can the man be racist? They all got along fine with him. I was the only oddball. Uh, the other thing I want us to understand is that when we emotionally connect with a story, whatever is happening in the story, our body reacts as if it's happening to us. Remember, the subconscious cannot tell the difference. It can tell that it's not real. That's why you cry at a movie. Your subconscious doesn't realize that it's grieving something on screen that's not even real. So again, our body reacts as if it's happening to us. The chemicals get released, the endorphins, the dopamine, the oxytocin, all of those things get released, and our body begins to react as if we're going through that. Now, when you combine that with the subconscious and the fact that we're creating stories to have meaning, a lot of times the stories that we tell ourselves aren't even real. So we've experienced something that's only in our head. Here's something else I want you to bear in mind about stories. The greater the impact of the experience, the greater the imprint it makes on us emotionally. And the greater the imprint that it makes, the greater the story we create about it. And the greater the story we create, the more central that story becomes to our identity. So if this story is now shaping my identity, how I see myself, if you change the story, you change who I am. And if you change the story, I might not know who I am any longer. In other words, the story that I create about and around my experience becomes a part of my personal survival package. Now I know y'all are like, okay, what in the world does any of this got to do with COVID? Just stay with me. We'll get there. Now, there's a lot more to meaning, purpose, and story that we're not going to get into because that's not the subject matter at hand. We'll do this in another podcast. But let me say these few things about story and then we'll get into COVID. Now, just like we manufacture and ascribe meaning, even when there is none, we do the same thing with the stories that we create. In other words, if there's not enough story for it to make sense, we create more story. Now, remember, the goal of the story is to arrive at a place called meaning. So in order to do that, we will omit facts, We will create facts, facts in quotations. We will change the chronological order of events. We will ignore logical inconsistencies. We will ascribe motive and intent and significance to something. Again, that's called the halo effect. We will misinterpret or reinterpret information. And that's not just the storyteller who does that. That's the person who's listening to the story who does that as well. Again, that's also important. You're going to see that in a minute. Now, we do all of that in order to avoid cognitive dissonance and or cognitive overload. So that's why we go through these mental gymnastics to make a story fit. That somebody else listening to it says, okay, that don't make no sense. Or somebody will say, okay, that's not what happened. So again, the stories that we tell ourselves, they become a part of our survival package. So now let's talk about COVID. COVID was a propaganda campaign that was introduced and presented to the American people in the form of a narrative. The story that was being pushed was an extinction level event that we as individuals and as a culture, as a civilization, are now facing extinction. We're about to be wiped off the face of the earth. That life as we know it, the civilizations and cultures that we built, our very survival is now being threatened. I want you to notice how they framed it. We are at war with an invisible enemy. They didn't want there to be any misunderstanding that we were in a fight for survival. Despite a 99.7% survival rate, cognitive dissonance kicking in. So, again, they said it was invisible. Now, in other words, we're fighting the enemy we can't see. They said it could live on surfaces for days, that it was airborne, and they said, wash your hands, don't touch your face. Now, that wasn't done as a safety tip. They wanted you to be in a state of constant awareness that you are in danger everywhere you go. And that if you're not careful, you can somehow even inflict harm upon yourself. So now, because we're in a war, that means that we have to be on high alert. That means that there are certain restrictions that the government is going to have to place in order to keep us safe. So that's how they got the restrictions through. And with this invisible enemy, the goal was to keep you in perpetual fear. You notice they never talked about building up your immune system because they didn't want to empower you. They wanted to entrap you. Again, our own homes became a prison. And notice the terms lockdown and social distancing, those are actual prison terms. They never gave us a means of empowerment, only entrapment. I talked about that in part 1, about the power of choice. Again, if you look at it as a narrative, you can see all of the plot devices. Notice how they refused to blame China early on. So now, that was a plot device itself. I believe it's called a MacGuffin, and if it's not, then one of you screenwriters or literature people, you can correct me on that. But again, as a plot device, they didn't blame China early on. Why? Because later in the narrative, they were going to introduce who they were going to blame. And that would be the people who question and refuse the vaccine. You'll notice that they are now the enemy. They are now the bad guys. They are the antagonist. Another plot device. Again, I talked about how it's an invisible enemy, one in which we had no defense against. Remember, there was no known cure. Then they introduced something called Operation Warp Speed. The quest is now on. The pursuit begins. So they introduce the drug gets introduced, and the story then morphs from an extinction event to a survivor story. And notice how they present the drug. Plot device again. They gave it EAU use. They gave it emergency authorization. So again, that's designed to do two things. One, to underscore the threat and the danger that we were in, and to present this new drug as a panacea, as a magic elixir. So again, if you look at it as a narrative, as a story, the level of fear that people were and still are walking in, that narrative left an indelible imprint upon who they are. So when you begin to question their story, you're questioning their very survival, because they lived in their minds through a traumatic event in which they could have died. So you're going to get pushback. And anytime you try to introduce a new quote unquote narrative by bringing up facts and stats, cognitive dissonance is going to kick in. They're going to shut down because you're changing in their mind what they lived through and what they experienced. So how do we combat this narrative? Well, first of all, to understand what the narrative is. And I talked about this in part one. I try to never call this experimental drug a vaccine, because when you do, you underscore their point. You're pushing their narrative now at that point, at that juncture. So that's one of the things that I try to do. The other thing that I try to do is that this is an age-old story. In other words, they say history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And we understand that if we are silent, we're giving into the narrative. Our voice is important. Our voice must be heard. So those are some of the things that we got to do. We got to speak up. We have to continue to educate ourselves with the facts, because when we present the facts, we have to present it in the form of a narrative that they're going to be able to receive and hear. Because if you don't, you won't override their narrative. All right, that's all I got for today. Until next time, peace.